Nobody saw it coming, the way that room went dead silent so fast. It was supposed to be one of those nights where politics and entertainment bumped into each other just enough to make headlines, not history. The lights were warm, the cameras were set, and the audience showed up for exactly what they always come for when Jimmy Kimmel steps on stage with Donald Trump lurking somewhere in the background. Sharp jokes, quick applause, and another round in a feud that had been boiling for years. But this night did not kick off like a normal late-night monologue, and it did not stay in safe territory for long. By the time it was over, the laughter in that room had turned into something completely different. It had become the sound people make when they realize they just watched someone's confidence crumble right in front of them. For days, Trump had been doing what he always does when a joke gets under his skin, talking loudly, repeatedly, and obsessively, in speeches, online posts, side comments to reporters, and half-finished rants delivered with that familiar mix of vanity and irritation. He kept pushing the same story over and over. Jimmy Kimmel was untalented. Jimmy Kimmel was weak. Jimmy Kimmel was fake. Jimmy Kimmel was low IQ. Trump loved that phrase. He used it the way insecure men use a hammer when they cannot build a real argument. Low IQ for reporters, low IQ for judges, low IQ for rivals, low IQ for anyone who managed to land a line that left a mark. This was not language meant to persuade anyone. It was language meant to shut the conversation down before it could even start. If you can brand someone as stupid, maybe nobody stops to ask why you sound so desperate to do it. Kimmel understood that pattern better than most people in public life. He knew Trump was not trying to win an argument. Trump was trying to shrink the person making the argument. That is what he always does. He takes criticism and tries to turn it into a ranking system, one where he automatically sits at the top just by repeating himself loudly enough. The trick works because a lot of people hear confidence and mistake it for proof. They hear volume and mistake it for clarity. They hear an insult and mistake it for strength. Kimmel had zero interest in playing that game on Trump's terms, and that is exactly what made the night feel dangerous from the very beginning. The audience could sense he was not coming out to trade cheap shots. He was coming out to flip the whole fight upside down. When Kimmel walked to the desk, he did not open with a quick impression or a throwaway punchline. He sat down, folded his hands, and looked straight into the main camera with the face of a man who had already decided exactly how the next 10 minutes were going to go. He said the former president had spent the last 2 days publicly diagnosing his intelligence, which was interesting because most doctors at least ask a question or two before they start screaming into a microphone. The room laughed, but it was careful laughter. The kind that comes when people hear the first crack of something much bigger opening up underneath a joke. Kimmel nodded, let it settle, and then said he had no interest in wasting the country's time defending his own IQ, because the far more interesting question was why Donald Trump seemed to believe that intelligence is something you prove by shouting it. That was the first move, and it landed because it was completely honest. Trump has always behaved like a man who suspects his own myth is thinner than he wants it to be. Truly intelligent people rarely feel the need to announce their brilliance every 12 minutes. Truly secure people do not keep walking into rooms demanding that strangers treat them like a genius. Yet Trump keeps doing exactly that. He reaches for the same handful of symbols every time the pressure rises. Wharton, cognitive test, stable genius, great memory, unmatched instincts, highest IQ, best words. The smartest people Nobody knows more than me. He treats intelligence the way a failing salesman treats a designer label, on hoping the name alone will do more work than the actual product underneath it. Kimmel understood that if he could pull that label away from the performance, even for just a moment, the whole structure might start to wobble. So instead of arguing back, Kimmel did something Trump absolutely hates. He slowed the tape down. He turned to the giant screen behind him and told the audience they were not there to trade insults that night. They were there to look at evidence. Then the clip started rolling. Trump talking at rallies, Trump talking in interviews, Trump standing at podiums, Trump trying to explain things and losing the thread halfway through his own sentence, Trump forgetting names, mixing up places, starting in one direction and drifting into grievance before the point ever fully arrived. Trump wandering from answer to boast, to complaint to self-praise without ever seeming to notice that the original question had been left behind on the floor. Kimmel did not crack a single joke over the footage. He just let it breathe. He let the pauses sit there. He let the audience hear every stumble, every loop, every strange jump in logic. By the time the screen went dark, the room was completely quiet. That silence was the real opening. Kimmel turned back to the camera and said, "The issue was not one insult. The issue was the pattern underneath the insult. Trump uses low IQ, he said, the way insecure men use mirrors, not to see themselves, but to accuse the reflection." That line pulled a much bigger laugh, but this time the laugh came with recognition. Like it felt earned because the audience had just watched the behavior play out with their own eyes. Kimmel kept his voice calm and steady as he explained that every single time a joke lands harder than Trump expected, every time a critic gets too close to a truth he does not want hanging in the room, every time an uncomfortable fact starts gaining traction, the same emergency language appears. Low IQ, weak, stupid, childish, no talent. It sounds like a rebuttal if you are not paying attention, but if you watch the timing closely, it starts to look less like confidence and more like someone frantically hitting a panic button. Then Kimmel did the thing that turned the whole segment from a monologue into an outright trap. He said that Trump had spent days talking about IQ like it was the final measure of human worth. And since Trump seemed so emotionally committed to that idea, maybe it was time to stop dancing around the topic and deal with it directly. The room leaned in. Kimmel smiled in a way that made it obvious he knew exactly what that sentence had just done. He said he would be perfectly happy to take an IQ test if Trump would take the exact same one at the same time, administered by real professionals under real conditions, with the results made fully public. No confusion, no bragging afterward, no invented numbers, just one clean, fair comparison. It was such a simple challenge that for half a second the audience did not even know how to react. Then the room absolutely exploded. The brilliance of that moment was that Kimmel did not present the challenge like a stunt. He presented it like the most reasonable response in the world. If a man keeps insisting that intelligence is the central issue, then surely he should be eager to test it in a fair and visible way. If Trump truly believed everything he said about his extraordinary mind, then this should have been the easiest invitation he had ever received. Kimmel leaned back and made the contrast even sharper. He said he was not the one who had spent 48 hours screaming about low IQ. He was not the one turning every disagreement into a scoreboard about mental superiority. Trump had chosen that arena. Trump had built that stage. Trump had painted the word genius on the wall behind himself. "So fine," Kimmel said. "Let's test it. Let's stop pretending. Let's see the score." Within minutes, that clip was absolutely everywhere. By the time Kimmel went to commercial, What the Challenge had already escaped the studio and started moving through the internet with the speed of a story whose shape people instantly understand. Trump insults. Kimmel responds with calm. Kimmel offers a real IQ test. Viewers do the math. That is the kind of story modern media loves because it needs almost no explanation. It is clean, it is visual, and it is emotionally easy to read. Trump predictably did not leave it alone. He never leaves these things alone. That is one of his deepest weaknesses. He cannot absorb mockery quietly because silence makes him look smaller, and looking smaller is one of the few sensations he genuinely cannot stand. So he fired back almost immediately. At first, the response had the usual Trump flavor. He mocked Kimmel's ratings. He mocked his face. He mocked his talent. He mocked the very idea that a comedian could ever stand beside him in any contest that mattered. He said Kimmel wanted attention. He said Kimmel was desperate. He said Kimmel should be very careful what he asked for, because nobody, absolutely nobody, wanted to compare minds with Donald Trump. It was pure Trump, all volume, all confidence, all the familiar bravado. But then something shifted in the performance, and Kimmel's audience had already been trained to spot exactly that kind of shift. Trump started talking about logistics instead of the principle. Who would administer the test? What kind of test would it be? Whether Kimmel was trying to cheat, whether the media would somehow manipulate the result, whether the challenge was even serious. The confidence was still there on the surface, but now it had company, calculation, evasion, irritation. A man who moments earlier should have been thrilled at the chance to crush a critic was suddenly hunting for the nearest exit. That is always the tell. Trump loves a contest, right up until the contest threatens to become something measurable. He loves the word test far more than he loves an actual test. He loves the idea of genius far more than he loves the possibility of having that genius examined under real conditions. He wants symbols that flatter him, not standards that bind him. The more people watched him respond, the clearer it became that Kimmel's challenge had done exactly what it was designed to do. It had forced Trump into a direct face-off with his own mythology. No more floating claims, no more imaginary numbers tossed into the air, no more self-awarded crowns. A real test would demand a real result, and a real result is the one thing men like Trump fear most when they have spent years living off symbolic superiority. The next day, the panic became fully visible. Trump did not simply reject the challenge. He began surrounding it with excuses. He said IQ tests are meaningless. Then he said they are meaningful, but not when chosen by hostile people. Then he said he had already taken tests and aced them, though he never seemed eager to clarify exactly what those tests actually measured. Then he suggested he might agree under certain conditions, but the conditions kept shifting every time he opened his mouth. It was the familiar dance of someone desperately trying to remain above a contest he had already accepted emotionally, but could not accept practically. Kimmel, meanwhile, I said very little, and he did not need to. The challenge itself was now doing all the work. Trump's own reactions were rewriting the story in real time. What had started as an attempt to humiliate a comedian had turned into a live, public demonstration of just how fragile Trump's confidence becomes the instant performance gets replaced by measurement. There is a reason this dynamic matters far beyond entertainment. Trump's obsession with intelligence is not just personal vanity. It is one of the central defensive structures of his entire public life. If he can convince supporters that he is operating on a higher plane than the people criticizing him, then every single flaw becomes reinterpretable. Rambling becomes complexity. Cruelty becomes toughness. White confusion becomes a sign that the simple-minded just do not grasp the larger strategy. That is why he cannot stop calling people low IQ. He needs the public to assume he is already above them before they even begin to evaluate the argument. It is a way of loading the hierarchy into every conversation before it even starts. Kimmel's challenge threatened that entire structure because it made the hierarchy something that had to be earned instead of something that could just be declared. Suddenly, Trump was not the man who gets to hand out the rankings. He was just another participant being asked whether he was willing to sit down and be measured like everyone else. When Kimmel returned to the subject the following night, he handled it with almost surgical calm. But he told the audience he had not expected Trump to say yes, but he also had not expected him to look quite so panicked by the idea. Then he did something even more damaging than the original challenge. He replayed Trump's changing reactions side by side. First the swagger, then the insult, then the boasting, then the questions, then the doubts, then the conditions, then the suggestion that maybe such a test would be beneath him anyway. The room erupted because once the sequence was laid out that way, the entire emotional arc became impossible to miss. Trump had not responded like a man offended by a ridiculous suggestion. He had responded like a man who felt the suggestion getting dangerously close to something he did not want tested. Kimmel's commentary over that second package was devastating, precisely because it was so restrained. He did not say Trump was scared in some cartoonish way. He said the pattern looked very familiar. It looked like what happens when a man spends years using a myth as a weapon and then gets asked to place that weapon on a table. He said Trump's greatest public skill has always been acting as though he is already the winner of contests that have not yet happened. He pre-writes the result, then dares everyone else to challenge the script. That technique works beautifully at rallies, in interviews, and in social media fights, because people absorb the emotional confidence before they ever examine the actual terms of the contest. But an IQ test, Kimmel said, is not supposed to work like that. Either you take the test or you do not. Either the score exists or it does not. Either you trust the results or you spend 48 hours explaining why a real result would somehow be unfair. That line drew one of the biggest laughs of the entire week. Trump could not stop addressing it because he could not stop imagining it. He had built so much of his public identity around the idea of superior intelligence that the possibility of a visible comparison, even a hypothetical one, felt like a threat to his very existence. That is what people were responding to. They were not simply laughing at the idea of a test. They were laughing at the sudden naked visibility of Trump's dependence on the idea that nobody should ever be allowed to test him seriously. And this is where the story becomes bigger than one feud. Trump's panic reveals something essential about how modern political myth-making works. It depends on imbalance. The myth-maker gets to make enormous claims, but everyone else is expected to challenge them only at great effort and under impossible conditions. The myth-maker can announce genius in 10 seconds. Critics must spend hours disproving it. The myth-maker can shout, "low IQ" once. Opponents must assemble evidence, context, and records just to answer it. That imbalance is exactly why people like Trump survive for so long inside obvious exaggeration. Kimmel's challenge disrupted it entirely. It turned the burden around. Trump says intelligence is the issue? Fine. Test it. That one simple move forced Trump out of myth-making mode and straight into avoidance mode. And avoidance is much, much harder to sell as strength. The public reaction kept intensifying because the challenge touched a nerve that millions of Americans already understood from their own lives. Everyone has met some version of the person who keeps announcing how brilliant they are because they cannot bear the thought that the room might quietly reach its own conclusion. Everyone has seen that boss who talks about his genius more than he ever demonstrates it. The family member who mistakes being loud for being wise. The man whose very first instinct when challenged is to call someone else stupid. Trump has simply scaled that exact type all the way up to the presidency. Kimmel's genius was not that he discovered some brand new truth about Trump. It was that he arranged a very familiar truth in a way that made it suddenly impossible to deny. A man who is genuinely secure in his intelligence does not spiral for 2 days over the possibility of a fair test. A man who is genuinely secure laughs, agrees, or simply ignores it. He does not panic. By the time the story had run its full course across the media, the emotional meaning of Trump's favorite insult had shifted for millions of people. Low IQ no longer sounded like automatic dominance. After Kimmel's challenge and Trump's reaction, it sounded more like a warning light. It sounded like the noise a threatened ego makes when something gets too close to the truth. That is real, lasting public damage, even if it never produces a formal consequence. Change the emotional coding of a phrase, and you weaken one of the most important tools a demagogue relies on. Trump will surely keep using that phrase. He has too much invested in it to stop. But he will now be using it in a world where far more people hear the panic underneath the volume, and that may be the single most important part of this entire episode. Kimmel did not beat Trump by calling him names harder or louder. He beat him by changing the frame entirely. Trump wanted the fight to stay small, personal, and tribal. Kimmel made it about measurement. Trump wanted intelligence to stay a mood. Kimmel made it conditional. Trump wanted the insult to function as a final verdict. Kimmel turned it into a question Trump could not answer cleanly without risking the entire myth itself. Once that happened, the story belonged to the challenge, not the insult. Trump fired back as he always does. Then he panicked in a way he rarely realizes the public can already see. And because the panic was visible, unfolding through his own shifting words and evasions, the whole country got a rare, unfiltered look at the fragility hiding underneath one of his loudest masks. That is what made this moment linger. Not just the joke, not just the challenge, but the sudden sight of a man who has spent years acting like the smartest person in every room, discovering that one calm, simple question might be enough to make the room look at him differently forever. That changed the feud in a far deeper way than any harsher insult ever could have. Before the challenge, Trump could still pretend that IQ was his favorite weapon, something he could point at other people whenever he needed to create distance between himself and a critic. After the challenge, IQ became a source of pressure. The very same word he had used to elevate himself now carried the memory of a moment when he had been asked very plainly to put up or shut up, and had done neither cleanly. People began hearing his boasts through that memory. Every new declaration of genius sounded slightly more frantic, slightly less majestic, slightly more dependent on the audience forgetting how he had behaved the last time somebody took him seriously enough to call his bluff. In public life, that kind of memory matters. It does not destroy a politician overnight, but it changes the emotional atmosphere around the phrases he relies on most. For a man like Trump, that is no small thing. He has spent his entire career building a protective bubble around himself out of repetition, symbolism, and performed confidence. If enough people hear him say something enough times, some of them begin treating the saying as proof. That is why he repeats so obsessively. He is not reinforcing the truth. He is manufacturing it socially. Kimmel interrupted that process by forcing one of Trump's most repeated claims into the real world of actual standards. The result did not require a lab coat, a panel of experts, or a sealed document. It required only a challenge and a reaction. Sometimes that is genuinely all it takes to expose what a myth is really made of. And once people have seen the material up close, the shine never fully comes back. The word genius may still come out of Trump's mouth, but it now has to pass through the memory of a very public panic. And panic is a terrible look for a man trying to sell himself as the calmest and strongest, smartest mind in every room. That is why the revelation was so corrosive. Trump's intelligence mythology is not some isolated vanity. It sits at the very center of how many of his supporters process everything else about him. When he says something visibly false, the myth invites people to assume he is playing a deeper game. When he lashes out impulsively, the myth encourages them to read it as raw, instinctive force rather than emotional fragility. When he fumbles for an answer, the myth whispers that only lesser minds fail to see where he is headed. The myth is useful precisely because it converts ordinary warning signs into supposed evidence of hidden greatness. That is exactly why the constant need to announce genius is such a tell. A mythology that strong should not need daily reinforcement, and if the brilliance were truly obvious, it would not have to be marketed with the aggression of a clearance sale. Kimmel's segment made that contradiction impossible to ignore. A man who genuinely believes his intelligence will carry him does not spend every spare moment trying to convince the room of it. He demonstrates it through his judgment. He demonstrates it through his restraint. He demonstrates it through how he answers, not through how loudly he labels others. For some viewers, the most unsettling part of the whole episode was how instantly recognizable the behavior felt outside of politics. Trump's low IQ reflex looks exactly like the habits of insecure bosses, thin-skinned family patriarchs, and loud men in every field who simply cannot tolerate the existence of anyone they cannot socially dominate. Those men often survive for years because the people around them get worn down. They stop confronting the pattern because the confrontation itself is exhausting and repetitive. Trump has simply scaled that social dynamic all the way up to the presidency, and he counts on the public getting too tired to keep noticing. Kimmel, by stepping back and naming the pattern clearly, gave people a way out of that exhaustion. He showed that the cycle is not natural weather. It is a repeated move with a repeated purpose. Once viewers understand that, they become a little less vulnerable to it every single time it happens again. That may be exactly why the segment felt so deeply satisfying, even to people who are not especially interested in Kimmel himself. It was never really about whether one host got the better of one politician in a feud. It was about the pleasure of watching a manipulative pattern lose some of its camouflage. Public life today often feels like a contest between fog and fatigue. Politicians and media figures flood the culture with so much noise that ordinary people can no longer tell what deserves attention or how to hold on to any one truth. Kimmel's segment cut straight through that by doing one thing exceptionally well. It took a specific behavior, named it accurately, and connected it to a larger structure of insecurity and evasion. Trump depends on that imbalance completely. The moment someone becomes clearer than he is loud, even briefly, the myth starts looking brittle. Kimmel also benefited from the fact that Trump's public image has aged in a very revealing way. In earlier years, some viewers could still tell themselves that the swagger was hiding some unusual force of will or genuine insight, but repetition changes everything. When people hear the same boasts for the 100th time, they stop sounding bold and start sounding desperate. The genius language now carries years of sediment. It is layered with every old claim, every bizarre test brag, every moment where Trump confused a basic cognitive screening with proof of extraordinary intellect, every rant in which he tried to bury criticism under an avalanche of self-praise. Kimmel was tapping directly into that accumulated exhaustion, and he did not need to build the case from nothing, because the country had already spent years watching Trump overuse the exact same mythology. While all Kimmel had to do was gather the fragments into one frame and ask the obvious question, why does a supposed genius sound so terrified every time someone laughs at him? By the end of the night, viewers were left with a far clearer understanding of what had actually happened. Trump had tried to reduce a critic with an insult. Kimmel had widened the frame until the insult exposed the insulter instead. Trump had wanted the exchange to work like a simple hierarchy: president above comedian, genius above fool, strength above weakness. Kimmel turned it into something else entirely, a public demonstration that the loudest language of superiority very often comes straight from the deepest insecurity in the room. That reversal matters because it gives the audience a completely new way to hear old lines. The next time Trump says low IQ, many people will no longer hear dominance. They will hear a warning flare, a sign that a fact, a joke, or a criticism has reached him far more deeply than he wants anyone to know. And that, finally, is why this segment will last far longer than the news cycle that produced it. It changed the emotional meaning of a phrase Trump uses constantly. Before, that phrase could still intimidate some people, or at least distract them. After Kimmel, it sounds thinner. It sounds like projection. It sounds like panic dressed up as bravado. Change the coding, and even if the words stay exactly the same, the effect starts to weaken. Trump will keep using the insult. He has too much invested in it to stop. But he will now be using it in an altered world, a world where millions of viewers have seen the tape and heard the pattern and learned to recognize the panic button the moment he slams his hand against it. The segment also exposed something many Americans had long sensed but had never seen framed so clearly. Trump does not use intelligence the way serious people use it, as a measure of clarity, discipline, judgment, or honesty. He uses it the way insecure performers use costume jewelry. He flashes it under stage lights and hopes nobody looks too closely. That is exactly why he prefers vague boasts to fixed standards, why he loves the phrase highest IQ, far more than he loves any actual score, why he talks about tests in the abstract, while visibly shrinking from the plain reality of a test administered under conditions he does not control. Kimmel did not need to call him a fraud. He only had to make the audience notice how deeply allergic Trump had become to one simple word: yes. That allergy told its own story. A man with real certainty does not spend 2 days circling a challenge like a cat avoiding a bathtub. A man with real certainty either accepts or dismisses without visible agitation. Trump did neither. He hovered, he postured, he inflated, he qualified. He searched desperately for a version of the contest he could win without ever being measured. That is not how confidence behaves when it is rooted in something solid. That is how confidence behaves when it has been borrowed. And the bill just arrived. People could feel that. And because they could feel it, the clip stayed alive far longer than most viral moments ever do. It stopped being about a host and a president. It became about a type that everyone has encountered personally. The man who keeps telling you how extraordinary he is because he is absolutely terrified that ordinary scrutiny will make him look average. The man who attacks your intelligence because he cannot sit comfortably with questions about his own. The man who mistakes self-mythology for identity and then panics the moment somebody asks him to prove even one piece of it in public. Trump has lived inside that type for a very long time, but Kimmel's challenge briefly trapped that type inside a spotlight bright enough for millions of people to see clearly. And once that happens, even the oldest tricks do not work the same way anymore. Trump can keep shouting low IQ. He can keep telling crowds he is a genius. Well, he can keep wrapping himself in all that old, familiar language, but some part of the audience now hears the strain in it. Some part of the country remembers exactly what happened when one calm, simple challenge entered the room and simply refused to leave. That memory is the real story. It is the reason the panic mattered. It is the reason the joke landed. And it is the reason Trump, for all his noise, walked out of that fight sounding less like the smartest man in the room and more like the only man there who could not stop proving just how much the question scared him.